Guys, welcome back. We are still reviewing for our culminating activity coming up next week. So, today we are going to be looking at the beginning and some of the effects of World War II early on. So, in Europe, after World War I, we know that Europe was very destroyed, right? Germany was destroyed. They were having a lot of economic issues, being responsible for reparations of the war, spending upwards of the high tens of billions of dollars, and they didn't have the money. We had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and we see a lot of dictators rising at this point. So in Russia, you had um, Vladimir Lenin. He took power during World War One. Now, when he passed away, Joseph Stalin took power of the Communist Party in Russia, and he really wanted to modernize Russia. So they had state-controlled farming and industry, and the government actually decided that anyone that disagreed with them should die. So Stalin actually did these things called purges, and that was getting rid of anyone who disagreed with them politically, ideologically, or just for the good of the nation. These people weren't accepted in the country. By 1939, right before World War II starts, Stalin ends up rounding up about 7 million people, kills a million of them, and sends the rest to forced labor camps, or you might know them better as concentration camps. So, moving over to another country is Italy, and in 1919, Benito Mussolini um, take over in Italy. This is the Fascist Party. Now, fascism is a form of radical authoritarianism. It's characterized by dictatorial power and forcible suppression of opposition and control of industry and commerce. So the government controls everything. You have no options and kind of what to do, what you're going to spend your money on. What the government says goes, and that is it. Now, this does attract a lot of war veterans, anarchists, socialists, and others. Ironically, because you would think anarchists, who people who don't necessarily like government, had a government that controlled everything. Now, probably the biggest and most known dictator of this time is going to be Adolf Hitler. So I'm not going to get too much into him. You know who he is. He was a fascist dictator. Really kind of looked to Mussolini early on, saying, "Wow, this is how our country should be ran." Now, Germany itself, according to the Treaty of Versailles, was very was punished, right? So this led to an economic depression, far worse than America's Great Depression, but still a depression nonetheless. Now, there's a lack of funds, there's a lack of hope, and so this new um, political party called the Nazi Party, or the National Socialist German Workers' Party, took power with not too much resistance. And their whole thing was, we're going to focus on socialism, which ended up not necessarily being socialism. It was more communism. Well, no, it was socialism. I'm sorry. But it was economic means, meaning the government would provide what the people needed. And for a lot of Germans who didn't have anything, having the government come and give you things was a very bright uh, future for them. So, under the Treaty of Versailles, it told Germany that they could not have a military. But Hitler's like, yeah, I'm going to do this anyway. So, the government starts to build massive buildings, highways, starts building up their military, building up their forces and their arms, their guns, all that stuff. And by 1936, Germany actually had a 0% unemployment rate. Now, that doesn't count women or children or Jews or anyone who wasn't a white German male over the age of 16. But those numbers coming out of Germany made the world go, maybe Germany's doing something okay. Now, also in 1936, Hitler, Mussolini, and Hideki Tojo, the Emperor of Japan, created an alliance to kind of help each other out. This is going to be known as the Axis powers. Now, after becoming a leader of Germany, Hitler does create an army, even though this is against the Treaty of Versailles, and wants to reclaim the areas that were taken by the Treaty of Versailles after World War One. At this point, the League of Nations invoked something called appeasement. This means giving in to an aggressor to maintain peace. Um, and Hitler kind of ignored this call of appeasement. They're like, yeah, you know what? They went to the Rhineland, they took it, and at that point, the United Nations said, "You better not do anything else, or else." So, well, Hitler says, "I'm going to do what I want." Ends up invading Poland in 1939, and thus beginning World War II. Now, early on, Hitler realized that Stalin, the Russians, were really the only major threat in that European area that could uh, be a thorn in the side of Germany. So Hitler goes to Stalin and says, "Hey, we're not really going to be allies, but we won't attack you if you don't attack us." And this is known as the Non-Aggression Pact. This frees up Germany from any type of fear of invasion from the east, because from World War II, Hitler knows that fighting a war on two fronts is not good. And since they invaded Poland, um, the United Nations, France, England, they went to war with Germany. Now, early on in World War II, England was also recovering from economic struggle, like most of the world in 1940. They did, however, need assistance to fight Germany. By this point, France had fallen to Germany. Pretty much all the European countries had fallen to Germany or were staying out of the war entirely. So by 1940, the only country fighting against Great Britain, or sorry, the only country fighting against Germany was Great Britain. And the United States decided that America would support Britain with all aid short of war. That means that they are not going to send people to fight. They are not going to declare war, but they will supply materials. Um, and this is known as the Lend-Lease Act. Essentially, um, they would give battleships and weapons to Great Britain, and eventually they would pay them back over time. Before this, they had something called cash and carry, and these were non-military essentials. These are things like steel and fabric, but Britain had to come to the United States and pick up their supplies and go back using cash. And this is called cash and carry. Once Britain ran out of money, the Lend-Lease Act was passed, which supplied military goods, and they would lend it to Great Britain, and Great Britain would eventually pay them back after the war, either give them back the things that were lent to them, or they would pay them back uh, in monetary value. So Germany's conquered most of Europe. Um, But the U.S. is trying to stay neutral. Still, they know that they don't want to be involved in the war. They're recovering from the United States is recovering from a depression themselves, and FDR decides to pass neutrality acts. And this was passed in '36, saying we are going to maintain neutrality. We don't want to be involved in any of this stuff. Even though they did do cash and carry, and eventually they would go into the Lend-Lease Act, they still refused, or we still refused to enter the war. Now, moving over to Japan, Japan's democracy was in crisis, and this was prior to them joining up with the Germans and the Axis powers. But in the 20s and 30s, Japan was facing a declining economy like most of the world. They struggled to export any goods and really couldn't afford to pay any taxes placed on them on imports or anything like that. So a lot of Japanese blamed the democracy that was the democratic ran government in Japan at that time, and decided that they need to overhaul everything. So they go back to an imperialistic form of government, and there's a lot of radical nationalist groups in Japan that want to overthrow their weak democratic government. They want to end all the Western influence in the country, and eventually they would, and they would put Hirohito as general of or leader of Japan. Now, Japan very quickly, after doing this, decide, hey, let's go to war. So they invade Manchuria, China in 1931. This is known as the Manchurian incident. Now, a lot of people didn't realize that Japan had such military strength, but they had been building up their navy and building up their forces over the last several years. So going into China and taking it was a pretty big step for them, and really shocked the world. Now, and they kind of got stuck there for a little while. They still went around conquering smaller islands, um, and would eventually come back to China in 1937, trying to continue on. So, really, if you want to think about it, Japan kind of started World War II, but we don't teach that. Um, By 1939, the Japanese kind of find themselves stuck in China. They could not move forward, so they kind of just settled where they were. But just to keep in mind, Japan was very successful during the war, much like Germany. So Japan, between 1937 and 1942, conquered Manchuria, eastern China, Burma, Siam, French Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, Papua New Guinea, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, Marshall Islands, Guam, the Philippines, Korea, and a bunch of other small islands in the surrounding areas. Now, eventually, the Japanese realize that America is quite a threat to them. And Japan and Germany knows this as well. But in 1940, there's an American intelligence that intercepted a message from Japan to move naval forces in the Pacific close to the United States. Now, the United States expected the Japanese to attack, but they didn't know where. Would they attack, California? Would they attack on the coast somewhere, or somewhere else? So they were prepared, but they really couldn't prepare for anything. So come to December 7th, 1941, at around 7 a.m., the US radar picks up an anomaly, but it's ignored. They're like, I don't know what that is, let's just ignore it. Less than an hour later, more than 180 Japanese warplanes attacked the US naval base in Hawaii, known as Pearl Harbor. Now, pretty much half of the United States fleet was stationed there and was destroyed by the Japanese by 9:45 a.m. So only about an hour and a half after this starts, it ends, and there's 2,400 people killed, 1,200 wounded, 18 warplanes damaged, destroyed, and 18 warships destroyed or damaged beyond repair. So half the United States fleet is gone at this point. So the very next day, on December 8th, 1941, FDR goes to Congress and says, we need to declare war on Japan. And within the hour, they come back and say, yep, we're declaring war on Japan. So at that point, the United States says, okay, we're opening up a Pacific theater. And 3 days later, they declare war on the remaining Axis powers, Italy and Germany. So we've suspended our neutrality and we are in World War II. Now you kind of got to ask, why are you attacking America? America is significantly larger than Japan, but Japan and Germany realize that America's industrial strength and its military power is far beyond what most people think. And Hitler actually planned on attacking the United States eventually, but Japan kind of jumped the gun and attacked Pearl Harbor, hoping that this attack would scare the Americans into remaining isolated during the war. Obviously, a big mistake because Americans don't like being invaded. Uh, so, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, this did inspire a lot of Americans to join the military. Over 16 million Americans would serve as soldiers, sailors, and pilots, and would be referred to as GIs or government issue. Now, leading up to the declaration of war, FDR knew that the United States might be drawn into the war. So, a year before the attack on Pearl Harbor, Congress authorizes the first Peacetime Selective Service Act. This is known as the draft. The United States will increase military spending from $2 billion to $10 billion. And so once Pearl Harbor happened, the United States was not just sitting there with their thumbs up their nose, they were ready to go to fight. And America was totally on board with this. They again went back to that practice of total war, which they did during the First World War. Right, individuals and communities did drives to get metal and clothing and stuff, rubber, aluminum cans, pretty much anything they could do to help supply supplies for the military. Also, the United States started offering war bonds. These are things that you would buy from the government. You would spend money, so the government would give money immediately, and over time, you could cash those bonds out over a period of time with interest. So you actually get more money back down the road. So wartime production increases significantly during this time. We're passing total war. In 1942, the government sets up the War Production Board, the WPB, to work alongside corporations to manufacture wartime products. And companies shifted from what they were making to military type things. Ford, for example, started making B 52 bombers. but did allow the American economy to continue to grow. And this really is what pulled us out of the Great Depression, is increasing that productivity during war. Now, Americans also are going to be practicing what's called rationing, right? They're going to use less, so the military and the government could have more throughout this wartime process. So the troops would have things they needed to be successful. No one would be starving. No one would be wanting for anything. Um, so Americans went to work. Those that weren't fighting worked, and the majority of these people working were women. They played a very vital role in the war effort. They took on building planes and tanks and weapons and bombs and everything they could. So you see women being a very influential part of this war effort. So by the mid 1940s, you have about 36% of all women in the workforce, which is a pretty astronomical number. Now moving on to propaganda. During the war, all countries used it, and we still do. Propaganda is information, especially of a bias or misleading nature, used to promote a particular political point of view or just a viewpoint in general. And all countries did this. Germany was very known for this in getting their people to have that anti-Semitic sentiment. Now, throughout the war, again, I'm moving fast, so bear with me. The United States was worried about Japanese spies, so they started these things called internment camps. They were worried that there were Japanese people living in America that were getting intel and sending it back to Japan. So in 1942, FDR signed something called Executive Order 9066, and this removed all alien people from the West Coast military zone. So anywhere that there was a military base or anything around there, airports, stuff like that, um, they would round up anyone with Japanese ancestry and move them to secure camps. A lot of people lose farms, homes, businesses, and would be moved into these camps for the duration of the war. Now, the camps were they weren't. It's terrible, right? You shouldn't put people in the camps. But they weren't like concentration camps. They weren't slave labor camps. Families typically lived in wooden barracks. They had cots, blankets, they had lights, they had bathrooms that they would share. They'd have dining facilities that they would share. But they were patrolled by guards, and they really couldn't leave. So we'll pick up this later on. We'll finish up the war next lesson. I know there's a lot of information thrown at you right now, but watch these videos. They will help you. See you next time.